straight over to David. David works for a Vuki management service who are partners of TRN. They're absolutely fascinating business who are making quite a big impact with their clients, both in terms of the corporate strategic support they give, the risk management support, and the whole compliance and legal support piece. So they're absolute experts in this space. And David's going to walk us through compliance and AI and the implications and things we need to think about. If you've got any questions, pop them in the chat or wait till the end. I think David's going to be talking for about 20 minutes, and then feel free to open up for any further questions. We'll get into them afterwards. But David, thank you for this. Looking forward to it. I'll hand straight over to you.
Thank you very much, Gordon, and welcome, Kiara, Michael, and Peter. Let me share my screen with you guys. And if you can all, or at least Gordon, if you can confirm that you can see my screen.
Looking good.
Perfect. Well, then let's just kick off. Artificial intelligence and compliance, half human or half machine. I came up with half man, half machine, and I was told off by my wife, and she was saying, come on, it's 2025 and you're a feminist. So I changed it to half human or half machine. But of course, you may well understand I'm a big fan of Terminator 2, one of the best kind of action films of all times. This is what Arnie was, of course, just battling out against a much more advanced T-1000. And who won that kind of battle in the end? Well, it was Arnie, because he became human throughout the film. You know, John Connor taught him how to laugh, to smile. And even in the end, he understood why John Connor was crying, and he ultimately committed suicide. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is we've got artificial intelligence, but you need human involvement. Right, so who am I? So I'm David Korthals. I am account manager at Vuki. Vuki kind of specializes in providing their clients with legal and compliance services, international expansion, M&A, and if you do need a good equity scheme, we'll always be around. I actually used to work in recruitment for about 10 years. So I was the head of compliance and investigator and Salt, and I worked for a Legis Group back in the days. And as you can tell, my accent is all over the place. I'm Dutch by origin, crossed the channel back in 2014, and I'm still here, and I live in Tunbridge Wells. Enough about me. What are the objectives for today, guys? So first of all, I don't like scaremongering. We're not here to scaremonger. But what we'd like to do with you guys is to create awareness of some of the key considerations when implementing AI hiring tools in your business. At the end, just want to have a productive discussion with each other on the use of AI, its challenges, and how to implement it in your business. We will look at it from a legal perspective, but if you want to discuss other angles, I'm all fine with that. But for now, we're just going to have a look at real examples of tools and products reshaping the recruiter's toolkit. Then we'll cover the legal landscape. I will cover some, I'll give you some practical kind of tips on how to go about this, how to implement, integrate AI into your recruitment processes without falling into compliance pitfalls. And we'll finish up with a group discussion. So, disclaimer, we're not going to talk about all the legislation that applies. There's simply too much out there. I'm not going to cover all the implications that you may need to consider. And a big disclaimer, it simply doesn't constitute legal advice, right? We're here to provide you with the knowledge so we can have a meaningful discussion with each other. Doesn't mean we're not going to cover any contents. But first of all, what's AI? You probably all know what AI is. And the EU AI Act, a regulation that was introduced in 2024, an EU regulation, comes up with a very lengthy definition. I'm not cover all of that. But what it does say is infers from the input it receives how to generate outputs, such as predictions, content, recommendations, or decisions, right? That can influence physical or virtual environments. Bit complex, bit lengthy, and today we're really talking about recruitment artificial intelligence, right? You already know kind of what that is. It's essentially tools and platforms that apply machine learning, natural language processing, predictive analytics, and other AI techniques to assist in screening resumes, psychometric testing, scheduling interviews, candidate onboarding, candidate sourcing, you name it. I actually spoke to two providers recently, just to give you an example. There's one company called 360 AI, They showed me a platform. They scrape all their CVs of the internet, and then they come up with analytics like this type of candidate wants this type of salary. This is their notice period. This is what their average tenure is. These are our predictions. Really insightful, but at the same time, I was also thinking could be a bit biased. Anyway, there was another company, Fetch Talent, and like many of these other businesses, it was they provided me with they provided me with an opportunity to conduct an interview. I was talking to the AI bot. The first question I asked was, "Do you have any hobbies?" The AI bot responded straight away and said, "No, Mr. Korthals, I don't have any hobbies, and I would now like to discuss, your interview questions." Ultimately, I massively underperformed. I just want to see what will happen. Obviously, I would otherwise never underperform. And actually, the tool came back with a report that I thought was actually surprisingly mild. And I'm always keen, maybe at the discussion stage, to hear what you guys think of these kind of tools. But for now, let's just take a break, and I would like to hear from you. Can you just give me an example of AI that you use? What do you use it for? And just add it to the chat box for now, and we'll come on to that in a moment. So do feel free to type in to use the chat box. Right, really good. I'll crack on in a moment, but we'll come back to this later, Gordon.
Yeah.
All right. So now we're going to cover the most sexy landscape out of all of them, the regulatory landscape. Let's just think about it, guys. What are the key risks that we can think of and what legislation may be involved? You don't need to put it in the chat box, but have a think. So I, for example, would think straight away about, cybersecurity risks, but I could also think about discriminatory practices or bias, right? Maybe remember that Amazon tool that kind of favored kind of men above women. That was years ago, but those kind of two examples here, that maybe kind of there are many other kind of risks and legislation types of legislation that apply. But for now, let's just pick let's just select my favorite type of legislation, the UK GDPR and the EU GDPR. So the GDPR came out in 2018. Don't know if you remember, probably you do. It was a bit of a shock at the time. Businesses were really nervous. Many people already on LinkedIn were talking about the fines. EU GDPR fines up to 4% of the annual turnover. And what was the objective? Just taking back one step, that was actually just to protect fundamental rights and freedoms of natural people. In other words, to protect their personal data. For now, and then we know what happened, right? The UK made that glorious decision to leave the EU, pursued Brexit, but then following Brexit, they then had to come up with their own data protection framework, which was essentially the UK GDPR, which I wouldn't call it a full copy of the GDPR, but the principles are very, very similar. So for now, let's just cover a few of those principles. So just a refresher. The GDPR, the EU GDPR relates to EU residents. The UK GDPR relates to UK residents. You may be covered by both frameworks, but essentially those frameworks are very similar. Core principles, just to refresh your memory. So if you process candidates' data, you need to do it lawfully and you need to do it transparently. You only do it for certain purposes. You don't process too much data, only data that's really necessary. You make sure the data that you process is accurate. You don't keep that data for 40 years. You keep that data secure. And very importantly, you need to demonstrate accountability. So being compliant is not enough. You need to demonstrate that you are compliant. And I'll give you two examples. One of them, you probably have a data privacy notice on your website. You may have updated that recently. You may have not updated it in the last 5 years, but most businesses have a data privacy notice. And all that says is, you're a candidate, we're a recruiter, we process your data. This is how we process your data. Includes a couple of other things. And if you have any kind of complaints or worries, please contact us. So that's the data privacy notice. And then the other really big thing that we're talking about today is the data protection impact assessment that some of you may never have undertaken. And we'll come on to that in a moment. First of all, let's just really specifically focus on automated processing and profiling that produces legal or similar significant effects unless various conditions are satisfied. If you actually use AI to assess a candidate and they don't get the job or they do get the job, that has significant effects, right? Typically, you can't use these tools unless you have a contract in place with the candidate or you obtain their explicit consent. And you also need to make sure that you have a couple of safeguards in place, which actually sounds very much, it almost sounds like common sense, but most people still don't know this as law. So the candidate always needs to have an ability to obtain meaningful human intervention. They need to be able to express their point of view. I'm not happy with this. So therefore they need to have the right to contest a decision. And if they don't understand how the algorithm is used, they have the right to be informed about it, to access the logic and consequences. What you then can't say is, listen, this is way too difficult, right, for me. I just don't even understand the algorithm myself. It's not good enough. You need to be able to explain in a clear manner how the AI actually works. And then finally, as a candidate can object to profiling and direct marketing based on automated processing. So you need to have a process in place that if you do this, that people can opt out / object. What I would like to cover now is a data protection impact assessment. Most businesses who work in recruitment and ordinarily process data of their candidates, whether it's for permanent purposes or temporary recruitment, they quite often, their legal teams came to the conclusion like no DPIA is needed. But especially now where you use AI or profiling, you will need to think about this. And what is a data protection impact assessment? It requires you to come up with a description of the processing. You need to make an assessment of necessity and proportionality. You identify the risks to the individual's rights and freedoms, and then you think about measures to mitigate those risks. These data protection impact assessments are usually treated as paperwork. I wouldn't be surprised if people these days put input into ChatGPT, just create me one. But it is the foundation of good AI governance and risk mitigation. And if you do it well, it's pretty much evidence of compliance and due diligence in case of an investigation. And an investigation is usually triggered by a complaint or a data breach. That was the GDPR. I think we've got 5 more minutes, so I'll be talking for 5 more minutes, and then we're finally ready for our group discussion. If you decided not to pay attention, try and pay attention now, although you find that there are many principles in the EU Artificial Intelligence Act that are very similar to the GDPR. But anyway, Brussels decided it's not enough. We need to come up with another framework. So this happened on the 1st of August 2024. And the EU launched actually its first ever comprehensive legal framework on AI. There is no kind of piece of legislation or regulation just like it, right? You don't have this anywhere else in the world. GDPR focused on data protection, but this actually regulation focuses a lot more on protection of health, safety, environment. So think about medical procedures of course. You want human intervention to be in place there because it could save your life. Same with electric cars. So it's a big one-size-fits-all approach that takes into account all sorts of fundamental rights and interests of EU individuals. It does apply actually to providers, importers, distributors, and deployers, and I'll come on to that in a moment. The fines, of course, are range from 7.5 to 35 million, or 1 to 7% of your global annual turnover. So it is something to be taken seriously. For you guys, from a practical point of view, you really want to, obviously, I would always say you want to start paying attention now, but on the 2nd of August 2026, high-risk systems, the high-risk system obligations come into force. And that's a very, very important date for recruitment businesses, especially when you target EU individuals. So, like I said before, for now, we'll keep it simple. 2 people on this planet, a provider and a deployer. The provider is actually the party that makes the product available. The manufacturer, for example, they provide you with the product. You guys are the deployer. The recruitment business is a deployer. You use the system, right, in accordance with the instructions issued by the provider. Obviously, if you would tamper with the product, you materially modify the system's function or restrain it on new data sets, then you would actually become the provider. But we won't really go into great detail. Let's for now assume that you just be using the AI for what you need to use it for. I won't really talk about the role of distributors and importers. Typically, importers are the ones who import it into the EU, and the distributors are also in the supply chain, typically between the provider and the deployer. These parties usually need to ensure that the provider is compliant and do due diligence, but that's all I'll say about it. All parties these days, or actually from 2025 onwards already, have two very important obligations. And you guys, the recruiters, you already need to make sure that you have a sufficient level of AI literacy of your staff. Sounds a bit vague, but ideally, I think what that implicitly means is that you need to appoint someone who understands the AI and rolls out a training session to your consultants. You may even have to do it yourself or appoint an ops person to do this. And secondly, you must always maintain transparency. So, and this sounds really straightforward, but when someone's talking to an AI bot, that person needs to understand that they're talking to an AI bot. And you would say, well, that makes sense. That happens already. Well, I was talking to Anders and I today, and someone started talking to me. It was quite obvious that was a robot. But no one said to me, like, hey, this is a robot. I'm in the UK, Anders and I is in the UK, so they wouldn't be governed by this framework, but that could well change in the future. A lovely risk pillar. So we're looking at unacceptable risk, high risk, limited risk, minimal risk. We won't be talking about minimal risk. What's minimal risk? Think about your spam filter. Think about video games. Doesn't really generally pose a high risk to individuals unless you play Grand Theft Auto. But anyway, minimal risk. Limited risk, we're talking more about tools like ChatGPT, general purpose AI. There's some risks attached to that, and they have their own obligations that they need to adhere to, but that's not something you need to worry about for now. Unacceptable risk, for example, if you do profiling, you want to predict the likelihood of someone committing a crime, that would be banned within the EU, right? But we will now be focusing on high risk systems. And you may be surprised because you think like, we're recruiters, we're not medical professionals. However, if you use a system for recruitment, worker management, and access to self-employment purposes, and that system actually is likely to really be used for the recruitment or selections of natural persons, candidates, or you do targeted job advertisements, or you analyze and filter job applications, we simply evaluate candidates, you make a decision. This is classed as high risk. So CV parsers, automated interview analytics, personality or video-based scoring engines. That sounds pretty scary. Does that mean you can't use it anymore? No, absolutely not. We'll just focus on the obligations of the providers very briefly, and then we'll talk a bit more in more detail about your obligations as a recruitment business. You're then, for the purposes of the EU AI Act, you'll be seen as a deployer. So the provider, they of course need to make sure they've got an awful lot of paperwork in place, that they have technical documentation in place, they implement a system that there's always human oversight when they implement an AI tool. Very importantly, they actually need to be licensed. So before they place the tool on the market, that tool must receive CE marking and be registered in an EU AI database before it can be lawfully used for candidate assessment. But again, that only kicks into force next year. And again, it relates to the sourcing of EU residents. But it's quite important for you then, if you purchase a tool, to make sure that they are licensed. And also, there's a lot on you guys. So you have to make sure that you have technical and organizational measures in place, to make sure that you handle it appropriately. There needs to be human oversight in place. Hey, we already talked about that when we covered GDPR. You follow pretty much the handbook that's given to you by the provider. If there is a risk, you need to suspend the use of that system and inform the relevant parties, for example, the provider, distributor, or the market surveillance authority. Very importantly, you need to keep logs and you need to carry out a data protection impact assessment. When you deal with candidates, you have to tell them or make them aware that they are subject to the use of a high-risk system. And very surprisingly, if people make inquiries, you will need to cooperate with the relevant authorities, but that speaks for itself. So in essence, guys, in brief, if you operate or source EU candidates, according to this regulation, you need to verify that every high-risk AI supplier is certified. You maintain internal documentation showing due diligence and human oversight processes, and you need to demonstrate that your own deployment does not amplify discriminatory or privacy or other legal risks. And then you will now say to me, yeah, but I don't really recruit candidates in Europe. What's the problem? Yeah. Okay. But first of all, remember what we said about GDPR. There's a huge amount of overlap there. Then also, you quite often see that the EU is a bit of a market leader when it comes to these kind of laws. Other countries may be looking at adopting similar legislation. The UK is looking at that at the moment, but they were thinking about introducing a bill, but that's now been deferred. But I can guarantee that most of the stuff that's in this piece of legislation is already somewhere in existing kind of data protection cybersecurity legislation. There are some other areas of law like copyright law, consumer law that I won't be covering for now, labor laws that may apply. But again, there's potentially a lot to think about, and it really depends on the type of AI that you use, the variety of the systems, the risk attached to those systems. Right, so we now cover the legal framework. Finally, guys, we're almost there. But I did want to give you guys a couple of practical pointers. And I've actually introduced my own system. I just made it up. It's called Riddler. Sounds a bit like the Riddler and Batman. But yeah, it's not really a system as such, but I thought I'll give my own kind of ideas. I'll attach a name to that. First of all, research. Where do you source your candidates? What systems are you using at the moment? AI systems. How do those systems work? Do you understand them well enough? How do they process personal data? How do they make their decisions? What risk classification would you attach to that tool? Have you vetted the provider? Will they be certified from 2026 onwards, especially where you deal with EU candidate data? Would you consider, you probably will have to conduct data protection impact assessment. You may even want to check with the provider, how does this system actually manage AI bias? How do I avoid discriminatory practices? It's always good to monitor legal development and timelines for your region. That is notoriously difficult, but always people want to give you a hand with that, me included. Implement is the next one. Make sure that you have a genuine human review process in place. Train your staff so they understand the AI tool. So when the candidate has a question, that actually in principle they can answer the question. Maybe it's a really good time to reconsider your candidate's complaints or appeals process or subject access request policy. In recruitment, we're always talking about the candidate journey. Now is maybe the time to revisit that candidate journey. Maybe carry out audits or ask someone to carry out an audit. And at least if there are problems, track those problems or incidents and implement lessons learned. This is a great really excuse to create a beautiful AI policy. Document everything you do. Document the legal basis for a processing activity, right? So this tool does this, for example, include a consent mechanism. Maybe it's the right time to dust off your privacy notices and ask your legal team or legal partner to give them an update. If you feel there's an exception that applies, you don't have to do a data protection impact assessment, well then justify, write it down why you feel you don't need it. And very importantly, when you deal with your providers, with your AI providers, do you have an agreement with them in place? What does that agreement say? Do they push some responsibility back to you? Whereas you should actually push responsibility back to them if you have, of course, room for bargaining, which is a completely different matter. Very importantly, guys, inform your candidates about the use of AI, how it works, how they can get assistance. It can be really powerful to keep people engaged and advise them about the progress, but you do need to make sure that you understand the algorithms, the decisions that are made. Doesn't really mean if the candidate's not happy that they always, that they necessarily have the right to appeal. It may be, your decision may be final, but there needs to be a way for candidates to interact with you and for you to be open to candidates about your practices. Like I said before, you may want to appoint an AI officer in your company. That doesn't mean that has to be a full-time AI officer, but it may well be someone who's already responsible for data protection operations or IT implementation, and you assign a new task to them and you say, have a look at our AI tools and see if you can, if we're doing it the right way. Reinforce. Now is the time to reinforce your data privacy policies, your cybersecurity standards, and again, the Canada journey. And I would like to finish this presentation by saying the following. Artificial intelligence and compliance, half human or half machine. Artificial intelligence means involvement of human beings. It's ultimately about your candidate and your client experience. The unknown future rolls towards us. I face it for the first time with a sense of hope. Because if a machine, a Terminator, can learn the value of human life, maybe we can too. Thanks for listening, guys.
Brilliant, David. Thank you. There's a lot in there. I'm conscious of time, and I've got to say, the most compliance regulatory session that's brought to me the most chuckles. I enjoyed that. Really comprehensive as well. I'm guessing that we're still in a bit the Wild West at the moment, where most people haven't got their minds around everything that you've shared. Is that a fair assessment?
I haven't even to say it this way, I'm not even sure what to make of it myself.
Okay. All right.
But
Really?
what and then maybe that is unfortunately the way it is. But what I think is really important is you don't need to get, well, no one gets every single detail right. You have to look at your business, identify your high risk, and
Yeah.
then go from there. So that's what I would say. But it would be negligent from my side if I would keep this limited to 3 slides and say, just
Yeah.
do this and you're fine. But yeah, I've never worked in a business that got 100% right. I think if you get it in the bigger businesses, if they got it about 55% right, they've done a reasonable job.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the last thing I want to say is I think it's candidate experience. You need to think of a way to make sure if your candidates complain, you can nip that in the bud really quickly.
Yeah, definitely. And because you can't, if Canada does complain, you can't turn this on quickly. This has got to be work that you've invested in terms of getting
Yeah.
it over time.
It's quite often where candidates really complain and they find ways to make your life hard, where they all of
Yeah.
a sudden say, oh, can you
Yeah.
just tell me everything about your AI system? So, for example, a practical solution could be talk to your AI provider, make sure you have the documentation in place, maybe create an FAQ list if you feel that it could lead to some dissatisfied candidates, and that you almost say,
Yeah.
well, this is how the system works. It's an FAQ list, and that
Yeah.
it's just, it makes your life of yourself, but also your ops team, just a lot easier. That's what I did when I worked in compliance. We came up with an awful lot of FAQs. What happens if that candidate says this
Yeah.
or says A,
Yeah.
B, or C? And you give either your salespeople or probably your ops people a script,
Yeah.
and that makes your life just a lot easier throughout the day.
Yeah. Okay. Makes sense. Conscious of time, some people have a 2:30. David, thank you. We'll send you David's detail. Anybody who wants to pick up and continue the conversation offline to make sure you've got a plan and a strategy to make sure you're as compliant as you need to be. Professionalism and standards in the industry are increasing, will only increase. So we've got the opportunity to stay ahead of the curve. Thank you, David. Really, really comprehensive and useful and amusing. Guys, have a great rest of the week. Good to see you.